Okay, so back to the neurological exam. So remember, the neurological exam is a way to quickly assess a patient and try and get some information about uh, their nervous system and specific regions of their nervous system to localize injuries and possible disorders. The neurological exam includes several parts: the mental status exam, cranial nerve exam, sensory exam, motor exam, and the coordination or gait exam. Last time I introduced the mental status exam, which is primarily looking at the function of the cerebrum. We ask people to, if they know what date it is, what time it is, where they are, why they're being examined. We look at some checks of their memory, a really complex multimodal function, language and speech. We ask them to do a bunch of things to check on language and speech. We also, I didn't talk last time about the sensorium, but I'll say a little bit about it now. Making sure that they can get sensory information from various uh, sense receptors in the skin, and then judgment and abstract reasoning, planning, decision making, emotional regulation, impulse control, and personality. Those are areas in the prefrontal cortex. So we introduced that last time. The sensorium, whoops, going the wrong way. The sensorium was um, asking them to complete a verbal description of a task, and then to see if they can identify objects based on touch or on by feeling it with their hand. And I mentioned last time that we're doing the mental status exam to look at, one thing is to look at stroke, another thing is to look at dementia. And so I want to talk a little bit about my dad, because I spent 10 years taking care of my dad. That with my mother and we take care of him. He passed away about 4 years ago. He was a World War II veteran, a very smart guy, a chemist, navigator in the Air Force, but he suffered from dementia. It was what's called Wernicke-Korsakoff syndromes, which produces memory changes, primarily anterograde changes, which means he can't form new memories. Although there were some changes in his past memory, most of it was his inability to form new memories. He also had some frontal lobe damage, which were uh, led to something called confabulation, where he would confuse things and think he remembered something that never happened, and he couldn't do some of the things that he would normally do. Um, and so I saw health professionals give my dad mental status exams many times to assess his damage. And in his case, dementia dementia happens often because of aging, but in his case, Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome happens to people on a poor diet who are heavy drinkers or alcoholics. But it can be caused by drug abuse, infections, and certain things like that. And the primary symptom for most dementia is memory changes. There are losses in the number of neurons and the size of areas, particularly in the temporal and frontal lobes. And so you see a normal cross section on the top there, and the hippocampus is pointed out. And then on the bottom, you see someone that has dementia. And typically, you see expansion of the ventricles, the hollow spaces inside, and a reduced number of folds on the outside. And so memory changes are one of the primary things that happens. And those tell us about where the damage has occurred, the loss of neurons. And so that primarily is happening in temporal and frontal lobes. And so with my dad, he had memory changes. That was his biggest problem. But he also had changes in the ability to solve problems, changes in coordination. Um, he had some wandering issues, and not so much anxiety or depression, but he did have mood changes. And these were linked to those structural changes, which they could assess through these mental status exams. Okay, another part of the neurological exam is the cranial nerve exam. And this involves looking at the 12 pair of cranial nerves. And these nerves, um, four of them go to the special senses. And so we test the ability to taste, smell, to hear sounds, to orient to sounds. We check vision. Uh, Three of the cranial nerves are involved in eye movements. So we check gaze control. And we also check the midbrain, which is hooked up here, and so we check the ability to orient the eyes to sound. And so the information from the vestibular cochlear nerve comes from the ear, and that has to be coordinated with information from the eyes, and this happens in the midbrain. And so this orientation is allows us to assess what's going on in the midbrain. We're also going to check things like the ability to move the tongue, the ability for facial expressions. That's usually pretty obvious. That's controlled primarily by the facial nerve. Movements of the head and neck, sternocleidomastoid and trapezius, are controlled by cranial nerves. And then we can check a little bit of some reflexes there as well. The jaw muscles are controlled by cranial nerves. And this gives us very specific information on the nerves and the areas of the brain that are served by the nerves. Okay. Then there are sensory and motor exams that allow us to detect the function of spinal nerves and nerve tracts that are going up and down in the spinal cord. There you've got a guy with the dermatomes that are laid out on his skin. These are the areas that send sensory information back through specific spinal nerves. And so you can see his body there. Some of those are sacral, some are lumbar, then the T1 through 12 are thoracic, and C1 through 8 are cervical nerves. And so we can see these things going back to the brain. Most of those nerves are going to go back in the sensory pathways, which are in the dorsal part of the spinal cord of the cross section, or sometimes in the lateral part. We can also check motor pathways that are going back or coming from the spinal cord, and these are mostly in ventral and lateral regions. In the case of the motor things, you're looking at muscle strength and voluntary movement. You can assess tone, have them contract against resistance, and check reflexes. This can tell you about specific areas of the spinal cord. This lady here, she's showing you pronator drift. That's you close her eyes and ask her to put her arms out and hold them steady. And this shows damage to, I think, one of the lower neurons, because when she thinks she's holding them steady, it starts rotating. And so it's pronating. And so that's pronator drift. And so here you're getting very specific information about areas of the spinal cord and specific spinal nerve. Okay, and then the last part of the neurological exam looks at really the functions of the cerebellum and the motor pathways. And so this is the coordination and gait exams. And so here we're looking at tremor check reflexes, posture, and gait. This can allow us to assess the ability of the cerebellum to receive information from the cerebrum, to compare that with sensory nerves, incoming information from proprioceptors, and it also allows us to check on the function of this itself. And so again, here we'll often do like a check reflexes is contraction against resistance, and then you let the resistance go, and you see what happens with that. There's also a bunch of like station, where you have them stand and look at their posture, and have people walk and balance. The cerebellum is this is one of these multifunction regions where it's doing some really complex activity and is likely to be damaged by alcohol input. That's temporary, but alcohol and drugs can do some temporary damage. Sobriety checks involve generally these coordination and gait exams, but it can also be damaged by loss of neurons or by developmental disorders that happen, and so very, very important. Okay, so in summary, the mental status exam is assessing behavior, thoughts, perceptions, language, memory, and judgment. The cranial nerve exam assesses the special senses, gaze control, tongue, pharynx movement, facial expressions, touch sensations of the face, and head movement. The little guy there with he has the movements charted out for different cranial nerves and for the different muscles that move the eye. So you'd ask them to, the child to follow the movements of a pen in front of his face and see if he can do that correctly. Um, okay, the sensory exam assesses the ability to detect skin sensations, touch, vibration, temperature, pain, and proprioception from muscles. The motor exam assesses muscle tone, strength, posture, and movements. And the coordination and gait exam assesses the function and connections of the cerebellum, again, checking on strength, posture, and movements. Okay, very good.